Okay, so welcome to each one of you. We're just about a minute away from getting started on tonight's session dealing with optimizing your health outlook. I'm Dr. David DeRose, and I think we've got all our platforms functioning. I've got YouTube, looks like it's up and running. Ronnie will let me know if I'm diluted on that front. And we've got a number of you joining us on Zoom. And we have Facebook Live as well. So if you're having trouble on any of the platforms, just go to compasshealth.net/2020journey, and that'll give you the connecting information for YouTube, Facebook, as well as for Zoom. So it's great to have each one of you, and we are going to start at this point. Ronnie, if you'd be so kind as to also help keep an eye on letting folks into the meeting, that would be of help since we've got our waiting room functioning today. Okay, well, greetings to each one of you. We're launching the third in our series of optimizing your health outlook. And I'm going to go ahead and switch us right over to the PowerPoint for this evening. So we're talking about things that can make a true difference. And this is not just theory. These are things that I've seen make a significant difference for people over many years that I've had a chance to implement them with people. We're using things that we've featured in our book, The Methuselah Factor. And in the first 20 minutes of each session, we're looking at some new videos. We'll be premiering 2 videos tonight that have never been seen before. So this is a premiere. The only folks that have seen these are the producers. So you're some of the first folks that will actually be getting a look at that material. We're going to be rolling out 2 to 3 videos per week. Those of you who have begun this series with us a few weeks ago, you'll notice tonight we're rolling out videos 4 and 5. Video 6 will come out during the week. And what we're doing is basically giving you a whole series, a whole program that was designed to be a 30-day lifestyle change program. This is a limited time release. So what we're saying is, if you want to go on this journey, it's really important for you to do that, well, right away. Because come mid-July, some of the videos that we've released already will not be available. That's our way of trying to incentivize people from actually using these videos during this group journey that we're promoting. That's what the whole purpose of this series is. So one of the best ways to ensure that you'll get all the videos, because we're rolling them out not just on Tuesday nights, is to make sure you subscribe to my YouTube channel. So it's simply Compass Health Consulting. You'll get all the 30 videos between now and the end of August. So that's what the platform looks like on YouTube. Some people said, well, I went on to Compass Health and I got some other company. There actually are more than one Compass Health company in the US. We're Compass Health Consulting. And you can see it there, Compass Health, one word, Consulting. That's the YouTube channel. So you would subscribe to that channel and select notifications, and then you'll get a prompt every time we release a new video. And like I said, we're releasing 2 or 3 a week. If you are on that channel, for those of you who've been with us from the beginning, you realize that these live programs that we're doing Tuesday nights at 7 p.m., they are being archived on my YouTube channel as well. So you can pick those up, watch them. If you're coming in late tonight, for example, you said, oh, I missed the first 5 or 10 minutes, you can catch that on the YouTube recording. And then we've also got the background for the philosophical background, the scientific background for this program. We call it the Methuselah Factor. It has to do with optimizing your blood fluidity. We talk about how it can help you lower your blood pressure, improve your diabetes, help you lose weight, improve physically and mentally better. That's all in the Missing Link series of videos. Those are all free on Compass Health Consulting YouTube channel. So tonight we'll be looking at days 4 and 5 of this so-called 30-day program. Just realize we're spreading it out over a few months, so it's not coming at you quite like a fire hydrant, but hopefully in a way you can drink from the fountain a little easier. And like I said, come July 11th or so, some of these videos that we're initially releasing now will not be available. We want you to start using them right away, putting them into practice, and continuing them. Okay, so we're going to go to day 4 of the Methuselah Factor. We're going to actually be showing you a video for the first time, and that's going to require that I open a different screen for you. So let me just navigate over there, make sure it's up and running, and we'll watch that together. Like I said, this is the first time that that anyone is actually seeing this video. So you can feel either privileged, or if you don't like the video, you can say you spared others from the pain of having to watch the premiere. I don't think that's going to be the case, but here we go. We're going to go ahead and share this with you now. It's going to require that I change some volume settings. Welcome back to the Methuselah Factor, 30 Days to Better Health. I'm Dr. David DeRose. Today is day 4. Our topic, be big on beans. I've got to bring you back many years because some 16 years ago, I was not yet the host of the radio show that I've now been doing since that time, American Indian Living. But I had been given the privilege of working with many First Nation peoples at the Lifestyle Center of America in Oklahoma. Over my years in working with Native Americans, I've realized that across tribal lines, there is often something spoken about as the Three Sisters. This may sound familiar to you if you have Native roots, but even if you don't, perhaps you've connected with some of my popular videos like Listening to the Buffalo, where I speak about Native wisdom and how it can help us prevent diabetes, or my series that expands more fully on this, Reversing Diabetes Naturally. In these videos, I speak about one of the things that Native Americans have helped me to more fully appreciate, and that is the power of beans. The medical research actually says that this time-honored food in Indian country is something that can make a difference for just about anyone who's trying to improve their Methuselah factor or their blood sugar. In the chapter that deals with day 4 on our journey, chapter 18 in my book, The Methuselah Factor, I challenge people to enjoy beans on a daily basis and to think particularly, especially if they have diabetes, about including beans in a meal that, well, often in many settings, well, can raise the blood sugar quite a bit. I'm thinking of the breakfast meal. If you add beans to your breakfast or any other meal, it's going to tend to stabilize your blood sugar. But that's not all. Let me read from a summary done by Dr. Silvia Esperanza Suarez Martinez and colleagues as they looked comprehensively at the literature research on beans. Their team found far-reaching benefits of this somewhat humble food when it came to the ability of this single food group to decrease the risk of diabetes, high blood pressure, cardiovascular disease, cancer, and even more. Listen to some of the constituents that they found in beans. Phytic acid, alpha amylase inhibitors, glycosidase inhibitors, protease inhibitors, flavonoids including anthocyanins, soluble and insoluble fibers, and lectins. Now, I mean, this may just sound like some kind of academic exercise, but it's really not, because some of these very food constituents in beans that are being shown to give health-giving properties actually, well, have been spoken of negatively in some popular diet systems. Take, for example, lectins. Here's what I wrote about them in the book.
they've found themselves in the crosshairs of one popular diet system. However, as Suarez Martinez and colleagues point out, these compounds have documented benefits in curbing appetite and in helping with conditions as diverse as obesity and cancer. One of the reasons for the benefits of the bean family, those phytochemicals, those properties, can help your blood fluidity. Let me just give you one example. Remember I mentioned anthocyanins? That's right, those are in beans as well. Anthocyanins make your platelets less sticky. Those clotting cells of your blood, they make them less likely to clump together, and this improves your Methuselah factor. You say, okay, Dr. DeRose, I'd love to eat more beans, but I simply can't eat them. They just bloat me up. Let me give you some pointers. 3 simple things can make beans more digestible. I find many people, even if they think they don't tolerate beans, can tolerate beans if they do these 3 things. The first one is choose smaller beans. And you say, wait a minute, I read the book. That wasn't one of the 3 things. Well, smaller beans help us understand the first principle, and that is thoroughly cooking the bean. It's easier to thoroughly cook a small bean like a lentil than it would be a kidney bean or a navy bean. So here's the point. Stick with those smaller beans, cook them very thoroughly so that the bean falls apart. If you're doing that, they're going to be much more digestible. Second point. This one might be another obvious one for you because your grandmother told you to do it. And that is soaking the beans in water overnight, then pouring off the water, and the next day cooking the beans in fresh water. That again can decrease the gas forming capacity of the bean. The third thing, important but often overlooked, is getting a freezer bag. That's right, putting the beans into one of those Ziploc bags, slipping it into the freezer after it's fully cooked, and then re-thawing it. That can make the bean more digestible. I don't care how you do it, but my challenge today is to eat more beans every succeeding day of this program starting today. Part of your key to improving your Methuselah factor may be just increasing what we call your intake of legumes or beans. I'm Dr. David DeRose. My goal, give you better blood fluidity, help your physical performance, your mental performance, help you trim down. We're doing it all in 30 days. Today's message, eat more beans, take it to heart, and continue it throughout our 30-day journey.
Okay, so hopefully you enjoyed that video. I know we're getting a little bit of echo, but the reason for it is I'm going to be switching right away to a second video. Then we'll have a chance to hopefully interact. So we're going to move to day 5 right now. So this is day 5 of our Methuselah Factor videos. We'll just need to get that into the queue here for you. And make sure we've got my screen shared so you can see it. Okay, so we should be good here.
Welcome back to the Methuselah Factor, 30 Days to Better Health. I'm Dr. David DeRose. We are on day 5 on our 1-month journey. We're talking today about the importance of connecting with other people. Let me illustrate the power of this with some research that was done in Switzerland a while back. They looked at over 60 individuals. What they found is the less they were socially connected, the higher their levels of a blood clotting protein known as fibrinogen. And if you've read my book, if you've listened to my resources, you've learned that fibrinogen levels, the higher they are, the worse your blood fluidity. So here's the message. Connect with other people, make your blood more fluid. But the researchers in Switzerland didn't stop with that observation. It wasn't just that people who were disconnected had worse blood fluidity. When they got stressed, their blood fluidity got even worse. So at any point in time, social connections are powerful. So what is our challenge on day 5? I want you to connect with someone else, at least one other person each day. Connect with something that has to do with this program. Now, you may have it easy. You may be going through a community program where they're actually using my book as a textbook, the Methuselah Factor. They're using the resources in there as worksheets, kind of some of the workbook features, going through figure 15 and others, figure 16. They're using that as they go through the program, and you're dialoguing together, maybe on a weekly basis. Well, that's fine, but remember, my challenge is every day connect with someone. So if you're doing this as a group, make sure you've got a support person, a buddy, a fellow traveler, and you're getting on the phone. You're sending a text message. You're saying, hey, yesterday I heard about beans. I got this new bean recipe. I tried it. It was great. Would you like it? Do you see this? You're connecting with something that has to do with the program. Maybe you've been thinking about my encouragement to move more. Maybe you've been getting outside every day, taking a 5 or 10 minute walk. You say, you know what? It would be a whole lot easier if I had someone else to walk with. Partner up with your next door neighbor, someone across the street, and say, I'm going through a program to improve my blood fluidity. Would you be, over the next month, that's all, I'm not asking for a long-term commitment, would you be willing to walk with me? We'll hold ourselves accountable each morning for the next 25 days, or whatever's remaining in the program. Have you got the picture? The challenge is to find ways to connect, find ways to support other people with their health goals, because you're sharing what you're learning in this program, and they'll be supporting you. Those social connections will increase your likelihood of success. Day 5, it's a simple task, simple conceptually, but it's going to take a little bit of work, reaching out to somebody, sharing principles that you're learning, and allowing them to support you, holding yourself accountable to someone else. And by the way, it's not too late. If you want to say, grab some people at your workplace, grab some people at the place of worship where you attend, grab some people in a club and say, hey, why don't you go through this book with me? Why don't you watch these videos with me? Catch up over the next few days. I'll wait to watch day 6 until you're right where I'm at so we can go through it together. That's day 5 on our 30-day journey to better health, the Methuselah Factor. I'm Dr. David DeRose.
Okay, well, good to have each of you back with us. You said we've been with you all along. Well, let me make sure that we've got everything configured correctly so you're not getting so much reverberation. Okay, so is that coming through a little bit better for you? Okay. So it looks like we may be having a little bit of problem with the YouTube feed. So Ronnie, you want to check on that for us? Okay. So good to have each of you having joined us. We'll give you, the lighting is different on, I've got a couple of different devices that we're using today. And some work better with a little bit more lighting and others with less. So I'm interested in your feedback. Was that too traumatic for any of you, since we filmed this before all the social distancing recommendations? Was that stressful for you? Could you handle that okay? Seeing people actually putting their, putting their hands on top of each other's and things like that. Did that work for you all? Okay, so I can see that you're a very responsive group. I know you're all muted. You may be trying to speak up, but you can unmute yourself if you do have any feedback. So I hope you're getting the idea of why we're showing these videos and why we're doing it as a group. My son Victor is here with us. Victor, why don't you tell them what you're prepared to do if someone would like a partner as far as this program?
If someone needs a partner?
Right. Remember, you told you were giving people an opportunity to contact you, and you would pair people up in their local area.
Yes. If you reach out to me, we'll get it squared away and connect you and try to, set up a framework for, making those connections. So.
Yeah, so I appreciate Victor being available to do that. So if that makes sense to what we're talking about, is we've got, we find that most of the folks are not tuning into the lives, but we have probably 60 people or so that seem pretty regularly watching the presentations, either on YouTube, maybe now on Facebook as well. Facebook we've had some problems with, but it looks like it's up and running tonight. And then we've also had issues with, looks like we're having issues with YouTube. I don't know if you've checked that, Ronnie, but that seems like that might have been a little challenging for us as well. So anyway, that just gives you some feedback on what options we've got going for us. And I think we're looking better here. Okay. So others are giving me some feedback saying that they are getting the feed through on Facebook and on YouTube. Good. So really, that whole point of these social connections is to try to realize that there's power in going through this program with other people. And I'm going to switch over to the other camera because I think that's a little bit better projection for you. Give us a little bit more light. So that's kind of the goal, is to see if you every day in this program, you could be doing something differently. And one of the things we want to challenge you to do, and it's challenging me too, I'm thinking, did I eat any beans today? So I'm going to try to follow along with you and have some beans every day. I do eat quite a few beans, but I was planning on beans for lunch and it didn't happen. So I've got area to make improvement. Beans are real powerful for cholesterol, for blood pressure, diabetes, and for blood fluidity, as you heard me discuss in that video. Okay, so what we're going to do now is move to the spiritual component, and that's going to require we bring up the PowerPoint. So I'm going to just navigate over there again. Okay, so we're moving now to the spiritual component of tonight's program. And this, again, many of you who've been with us realize that this is something that we've included because optimal health really is a whole person endeavor. And so a spiritual component, I felt from the beginning, was incredibly important for this journey. And some of you say, well, you're also including a spiritual component because one of the things that inspired you was actually John Bradshaw's Hope Awakens meetings. And that is correct. Some of you actually viewed those meetings. And I know that there were some people talk with me today. They said, well, we really want to be in this meeting tonight, but we also want to be at the meetings that John Bradshaw is doing. Pastor Bradshaw, just like me, values this combination of the spiritual and the physical. So he's doing a series this week that's also being archived on YouTube called Take Charge of Your Life. And you can see the website there, takecharge.life. And he's premiering his stuff at 7 p.m. as well. So we've got some folks that were torn between the two. I said to the person I was talking with, I said, go ahead and watch Pastor Bradshaw's, that's fine, and catch ours on YouTube on the recording. So either way, whatever works for you. His series ends on Sunday, so there won't be a conflict next Tuesday. But anyway, my whole point was a lot of us who are, whether we come at it first from a medical end, like I do as a physician, or whether you come from a spiritual end first, like Pastor Bradshaw, people are saying people today are stressed. They're dealing with health challenges that are really unique. It's not just COVID-19, it's the effects of isolation and social distancing. And if we're going to be really serious about optimizing our health, we've got to kind of tackle this whole dimension. And so the spiritual dimension, we all feel is really important. So if you want to connect more on the spiritual dimension, I'm covering in these meetings different aspects that Pastor Bradshaw touched on, sometimes going into more detail with some things, less detail with others, but I'm giving it to you, especially from a physician's viewpoint. And that's what we want to continue looking at tonight. But if you want to connect with more of the spiritual resources that Pastor Bradshaw did an excellent job with, the website for that original series is hopeawakens.com or hopeawakens.org. So let's come back to this question that we started to tackle last week, and we'll probably deal with it over 3 weeks. So we talked about it last week, we'll talk about it tonight, and then look at other dimensions of it next week, because this is one of the things I believe that's undermining health in our world today. It's this whole aspect of suffering and pain and how we're dealing with it as individuals and as a society. One of the things we looked at last week is that many people, myself included, I was an agnostic as a young adult, have basically kind of said God isn't relevant because of all the nonsense happening on this planet. And what I asked the question of you last week is if there really is a God, wouldn't you expect him to be more intelligent than humanity? And with that in mind, let's look at what the Bible has to say about God's character. He says, my thoughts are not your thoughts, nor are your ways my ways, says the Lord. For as the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways, and my thoughts than your thoughts. Now you say, okay, so what does that all mean in the context of why there is sin and suffering on our planet, why there's pain? Well, the analogy I used last week that a number of people told me resonated with them was this. As a physician, we often have people come to us and to our clinics, and they want help with a symptom, a specific symptom, a specific problem. Let's say they come in with pain. Treating their pain can be doing them a disservice if the pain is a sign of a serious condition that needs to be addressed. And so we walked through this scenario last week. I'm not going to belabor it because here's the point. To just take away the symptom with a pill or even a natural remedy is not doing you a favor if I don't address the underlying disease. In fact, addressing the pain and the suffering may be doing you a terrible disservice. And from the biblical worldview, God's perspective is one of eternity. He's not just looking at how I'm feeling today or how I'm feeling next week. He's looking at eternity. The Bible says there's an eternity before us. And so if you say, well, I'm not sure that the Bible's relevant, I really believe it is. And I've walked down this journey that many of you might have been on yourselves. You might be on it right now, of questioning whether the Bible really is relevant. We've been trying to look at things from a medical, from a historical standpoint in the course of this series that say, you know, the Bible is a unique book. We looked at some of the science and some of the history behind it, some of the archaeology behind it. And now we're talking about some of the existential questions, the questions of meaning in life and what the Bible has to say about that. And I think it's the most compelling explanation for why we're here and why we deal with grief, suffering, pain. So God is looking from the perspective of eternity. And if we start to see through God's eyes, or if we try to see through God's eyes, I believe it changes our perspective. And that's what we're trying to do in the course of these few meetings that are focused on this topic. So last week, I spoke a little bit of detail about Deion Sanders. And I did not grow up or as a young man following Deion Sanders. Some of you say, well, you look like you're older than Deion. I actually think we're close to the same age. But the point is this. I was not, following his his story, but I learned about him in studying this interesting phenomenon where people tend to blame God for not giving people certain things, not removing their pain, not removing their poverty. Deion Sanders and King Solomon were two case histories we looked at last week. And I want to make sure we're all up to speed. I know we've got some new folks joining us, and I know it's been a week too, and sometimes a week's time can cause some of these things to drift from our memory somewhat. So here's what we're looking at. King Solomon and Deion Sanders both lived a life that we would say was the kind of life that the atheists seem to suggest God should guarantee for everyone. And the reason I'm saying it this way is because when people question God's existence, say, well, how could there be a God? There's all this poverty. There's famine. How could there be this disease? Well, here's two guys that were healthy. They were wealthy. They were in countries where they were living in peace. At the time of Solomon's reign, Israel was at peace with all its neighbors. Deion Sanders here in the United States, no active wars with other nations. There's not war on our doorstep, if you will, from a foreign invader. Perhaps some people would say, well, injustice, isolation, loneliness, all those things God should remove. Well, these guys didn't have those kind of problems, okay? And what I pointed out to you last week is when we looked at Deion Sanders' life, and by the way, we'll actually show you some of the Bible texts that I alluded to last week tonight. Sanders said he had everything. He had everything that the world had to offer, but he was empty. He had no peace. He had no joy. And my point is, the atheist criticizes God for not giving these tangible things to people, but people that have the tangible things that the atheist faults God for not giving people are not necessarily happy. They're not necessarily fulfilled. Here's King Solomon's words. Okay, he was the leader of what was perhaps in its day, in that area, perhaps the most powerful nation on earth in the time of the reign of David and Solomon. At least that's what the biblical record suggests. And here's what he's saying. He's saying vanity of vanities. Vanity of vanities, all is vanity. He's basically saying it's all futility. It's all nothingness. My life is meaningless. I have no meaning. I have no purpose. Same kind of story that we hear, 2,000 years later, even more than that, 2,600 years later or more from Deion Sanders. Listen to what Solomon said. He looked at everything he had done, everything he built, all his accomplishments. And what did he say? It was just like grasping after the wind. No profit under the sun. So you say, okay, what does this say about meaning in life? Well, here's the point. Even if every person had all that the atheists have charged God with not providing, many people who've had those things still didn't feel it was enough. Many of these very people have committed suicide, and we hear these stories every year. You hear about successful, rich, attractive people taking their lives. Why do they do it? And it's because what I would suggest to you that our focus, we focus too much on the symptoms and we're not focusing on the underlying disease. So yeah, the symptoms, pain, suffering, all this stuff is bad, poverty. I'm not saying this stuff is good, but the bigger problem, according to a biblical worldview, is something that's a deadly cancer. It's called sin. And the reason it's so deadly is because it separates us from God. Look at these Bible statements. This one in Psalm 16, by the way, this is David writing. He says, in your presence is fullness of joy. At your right hand are pleasures forevermore. I was speaking with someone not all that long ago who's dealing with a lot of health issues. Being a physician, even though my medical work is somewhat limited, I do locum tenens work. That means I go and help out in different clinics. I'm not in a full-time practice right now, but I still get a lot of people calling me and asking for medical advice and medical insights. This person going through a lot of health issues, and was talking with them about the story of Johnny Erickson Tata. Some of you may know Johnny's name. Johnny, as a young lady, teenager, dove into water that was shallower than she anticipated, ended up breaking her neck. She's a quadriplegic, has been that way for decades, but an amazing woman. And she said things like, I'd rather be in a wheelchair and know God than not have God and be fully functional. The point is, even though she admits she's got chronic pain, she's suffering, but she's a joyful woman. Why? Because she's walking in God's presence. You see, the Bible says the thing that is killing us as far as our eternal well-being is something called sin. The Bible says our sins or our iniquities have separated us from God. And the Bible reveals God to be the one who is the source of life, not only the source of joy and peace. So from a biblical worldview, pain and suffering are consequences of separation from God. And our whole planet is that way. We'll be looking at that in a minute. They're not punishments or judgments, but they're the consequences, the natural consequences of disconnection. And what motivated Deion Sanders and Solomon to look for solutions in their life, for something better, was that they experienced pain. Deion Sanders, playing 2 professional sports at the same time. I mean, not at the same moment, of course. He was playing professional football and professional baseball. Yeah, I'm sure he got beat up. I'm sure he had aches and pains. But the pain that he had that was horrible was a pain in his heart because he wasn't connected with his loving creator. He ultimately did make that connection. So let's step back and look at a new illustration tonight that kind of brings us all together. And this is drawn from a book that I read some years ago called The Gift of Pain. It was written by someone by the name of Dr. Brand, Dr. Paul Wilson Brand. Dr. Paul Brand was a missionary and a leprosy surgeon, did a lot of his work in Africa. A good friend of ours, both my wife's and mine, also actually has a history as a leprosy surgeon. He's an orthopedic surgeon. He's been retired for some years, but Dr. Ray Foster. And Dr. Foster and Philip Yancey both readily attested to the fact that pain can be a blessing. And let me just give you some illustrations. I think it was Dr. Foster that told this story of how he had a patient that one night was sleeping and smelled something burning. And he was living in humble surroundings in Africa, a little thatched roof home. And when he smelled something burning, he was thinking, is it coming from outdoors? Is it in here? He ran outside, and it seemed that the smoke smell was following him. He had first kind of thought it was in the little home that he lived in. And then he saw it. He looked down. His hand was literally on fire. This man had leprosy. And one of the things that leprosy does is it destroys your nerves. So the reason why lepers lose digits, lose fingers, lose toes, lose limbs is not because the leprosy eats away their arms and legs. It's because it destroys their sense of pain. And so Paul Brand and Ray Foster were telling us that pain is not necessarily something bad. It can get your attention that you need to change something. Now, I'm not a leprosy surgeon, nor am I a leper. But I have dealt with people who have had nerve problems. The common nerve problem that I've seen in my course of work as an internal medicine specialist is diabetes. And I've seen patients. I remember one patient that came to our clinic. They said one day they noticed there was something on their carpeting. And they looked, and it looked like blood and pus on their carpet. And they said, well, where did that come from? Did I step in something? And then they, got a mirror or something to look down at their feet. They had some challenges, I guess, looking at their feet. And they realized that there was a tack, a thumbtack in their sole of their foot that had apparently been there for a number of days and had become infected. Now it was bleeding pus on the carpet. They never felt it. Now you say, boy, if I just get a little twig or a little pebble in my shoe, I've got to stop and take it out. This is not bad. So pain and suffering show us that something's wrong. And so to demand that God remove all pain and suffering from our planet, the question is, would this be doing humanity a service? Because the pain and suffering is showing us that something's wrong. As individuals, we're often separated from God. Our pain and suffering calls us to the one who gives meaning and fullness to life. You say, but okay, well then why did God allow sin? If sin separates us from God, why did God allow us? And if there's a good explanation even for sin's existence, there's got to be a remedy. So let's talk about these things together. And we want to first look at this question of where sin came from. And the Bible, first of all, reveals that God did not create sin. There was no sin. There was no suffering. There was no death in the very beginning. Okay? You say, well, then where did it come from? Well, let's look at it. Now, I know if you're like me, in my history, I would say, well, I mean, some of this stuff, this is kind of perplexing because this isn't the idea that most of us had necessarily. Maybe just growing up from a, kind of a secular viewpoint, not much of a spiritual perspective. But what I'm trying to help you see here is that from a biblical perspective, it creates a picture of God creating a perfect world. Everything is perfect in the original creation. And if you look at the last two chapters of the Bible, God recreates the world. At the conclusion of Earth's history, everything's perfect. No sin, no suffering, no separation from God. God is there physically present with people. So from a biblical worldview, sin started in heaven. That's right. We'll look at that in just a minute. And then it came to planet Earth. Let's look at a few of these verses. And some of you noticed, if you did see Pastor Bradshaw's series, Hope Awakens, he went into more detail about this background. And I want to look at it with you, though, because this is really foundational. From the biblical worldview, sin started with a perfect being. He was called Lucifer. Lucifer actually means light bearer. So Lucifer was a noble name that was given to him. And in this prophecy in Isaiah 14, it spoke about Lucifer being cut down to the ground, the one who weakened the nations. What was his problem? He said, I will ascend into heaven. I will exalt my throne above the stars of God. I will also sit on the mount of the congregation. On the farthest side of the north, I will ascend above the heights of the clouds. I will be like the Most High. Basically, whether you understand the imagery, the poetry of the Old Testament, Satan is saying, I'm going to stand in God's place. And so sin started with pride in heaven, a perfect being called Lucifer. And if you say, I didn't pick up all that in Isaiah 14, well, there's a parallel passage in Ezekiel 28. God speaks about this being called Lucifer. He's described there in Ezekiel 28 as the anointed cherub who covers. He was the one who was in the throne room of heaven. He was on the holy mountain of God. And it says it in plain English here, of course, translated from the Hebrew. You were perfect in your ways from the day you were created till iniquity was found in you. And so you say, what's going on in here? How does this happen? How does someone created perfect, this perfect being, Lucifer? It's because of pride. And he separates himself from God. This is the essence of sin. It's the absence of love. It's breaking a trusting faith relationship with God. And that's where sin started. So the point is this: God didn't create sin. He didn't create the devil. Lucifer, the light bearer, a perfect being, chose to sin. And then a lot of people say, well, wait a minute. Well, if sin's so bad, if that's what brings pain and suffering, why didn't God destroy Lucifer immediately? Well, let's just think this through. The Bible reveals God to be a God of love. Not only a God of love, it says by definition, God's character is love. So you say, well, okay. Well, how about this in Jeremiah? This is God, I believe he says this to everyone. I've loved you with an everlasting love. Therefore, with loving kindness have I drawn you. You say, well, so what does this have to do with not destroying Satan. I mean, shouldn't he have just destroyed Satan, just wiped him out? If he loved his other created beings, wouldn't he have done that? Well, think about this for a minute. If God had destroyed Satan, would this have promoted love among the other angels? You see, the Bible says that Satan had sympathizers in heaven. And we get that from the book of Revelation. Let's just look at it here. It says, war broke out in heaven. Michael and his angels fought with the dragon. That's the name for Satan. And the dragon and his angels fought, but they didn't prevail, nor was a place found for them in heaven any longer. So the great dragon, that's Satan, was cast out. If you want to read the connection and the identification of the dragon as Satan, just read the context of Revelation 12. I'm trying to be a little bit more succinct here for you, but here's the point. Satan had sympathizers in heaven. He had allies in heaven, angels that had allied themselves with him. So think about it this way. Love only exists in the context of freedom. You can't make a robot who loves you, right? You have to be able to choose to love. So if Lucifer had been created without the capacity to sin, in other words, without the capacity to not love, then he couldn't really have loved at all. Now, it may sound like circular reasoning, but think about it. If God is going to create beings who can love him, they have to have the ability not to love him, or they can't freely choose to love. And so God creates beings with this ability. First in heaven. That's the picture that we get from the Bible. And you'll see the footnote that I've put on this slide. We will see that the essence of sin is not loving. Okay? And maybe I should have put that in bold print. It's not loving. It's not love. It's breaking love. Since God's character is love, that which separates us from him is a lack of love. And so that's what Satan was doing. He was distrusting God. He was not loving him. He was breaking his relationship with God. That's the essence of sin. Now let's come back to the question. God could have said to Satan, love me or I'll kill you. Do what I follow me or I'll kill you. And when Satan disobeyed, he could have killed him. So how many of you think that this promotes love? So I'm not going to ask Victor, who's my son, on here. I have 3 children, but let's just say I had 12. And instead of Victor being my second born, he was my 8th born, okay? And as a little boy, he saw each of his siblings disappear, his older siblings. And every now and then when one wasn't around the table, I said, well, they disobeyed me, they didn't love me, so I just killed them. Now, how many of you think this might change Victor's behavior? How many of you say, well, of course, if he saw those who didn't love you, then he's going to love you even more because he doesn't want to be killed? No, right? This is a tyrant that kills people who don't give them the respect and the love that he or she thinks is deserved. And so God doesn't destroy Satan. Why? Because there are people that are sympathizing with Satan in his distrust of God. So now sin in the Bible story comes to planet Earth. Now remember, if you're making this connection that love and trust go together, you keep that in mind as we look at how the Bible says sin enters our planet. And it comes to us from Genesis chapter 3. It says there was this creature called the serpent. Now, if you read through Genesis 3 carefully, you'll see that most all the artwork that is done to illustrate this experience in the garden is inaccurate, because there was not a serpent that looks like the snakes that we see today. Because you'll see as you read through Genesis 3, this serpent was cursed to be on the ground. So these snakes, these serpents that we see today, I don't think this original serpent looked at all like that. It says he was more cunning than any beast of the field which the Lord God had made. And this serpent actually speaks to the woman and says to her, has God indeed said, you shall not eat of every tree of the garden? Many of you know the story. Eve says, no, I can eat anything, just not from this one tree. If I eat from this tree, God said I will die. And you know what the dialogue plays out. The serpent says these words, "You shall not surely die." What's going on here? The serpent is saying God is not trustworthy. He's not worthy of your unconditional love. You can't believe what God says. God is trying to keep something from you. He's trying to keep a knowledge from you. You really need to listen to me. And so the woman, instead of trusting God and showing her trust and love for God by obeying, doing what he asks. I mean, isn't that what love does? I mean, if you know something bothers someone that you love, are you going to do it? I mean, not if you're really, acting out of love to that person. You say, oh, well, sometimes I'm just, fooling around with my friend and I do something that bothers them. But if it's something that breaks the relationship, you wouldn't do it, right? The woman distrusts God, listens to the serpent, and then look what it says. It says, the woman saw that the tree was good for food. What is she relying on? Look at the next words. She sees it was pleasant to the eyes. It appeared to be a tree desirable to make one wise. So what is she doing? She's trusting in her human judgment. She's not trusting in what God has said. Now, this is really a crazy story because we're talking about why there's sin and suffering, and we're talking about this charge that the atheist gives to God. The atheist says, God is not trustworthy. God is not taking care of us. If God were good, he'd give you better things. You can see better for yourself and take care of yourself better than God is doing. So don't trust him. Take matters into your own hands. I mean, I find it amazing because the Bible anticipated all the arguments of the atheists. Really. And again, I never considered myself an atheist. I considered myself an agnostic. Some of you might say, well, that's because you're a scientist. I mean, I wasn't a scientist at that stage of my life, but I had not completed my medical training, for example. But here's the deal. Solid scientists say to say you're an atheist is not scientific because you can't disprove the existence of God. I mean, think about it. I mean, someone says, well, there's no evidence of God. Well, someone could ask the question, well, how do you know there's not God on some planet far, far away? Well, I don't think of God. Can you prove that there's no God? From a scientific method standpoint, you cannot prove there's no God. So a lot of scientists even who don't believe in God necessarily, they're not sure there's a God, but they're saying we're agnostics. So I think this is at least more responsible. So anyway, I was an agnostic, but I was using, I think as I look back on it, some of the very same arguments that Satan was using. I'm trusting my own judgment instead of trusting what God revealed. Very interesting. So a lot of people say, I don't know what God revealed. That's why we're going through some of these biblical themes, because I believe if you really look at the Bible honestly, there is nothing in the world that explains what we're dealing with on our planet better than the Bible. And there's external evidence. We talked about this in one of our first couple of presentations, the archaeologic evidence. I just gave you a few examples from the book of Daniel, some of the archaeology that goes along with that. But the Bible says, hey, the evidence, the archaeologic evidence says, take a serious look at what the Bible has to say. So let's come now back to the problem. The problem is here in Eden, Eve distrusted God. In so doing, she said she didn't really believe that God was all loving. She broke faith with God. She chose to love, if you will, her own opinion rather than the one who had demonstrated love for her. And as a result, she believes Satan's charge that God is a liar. What happens? It separates her from God. That's the essence of sin. That is the essence of sin. So Satan's focus, not on God, but on self. He trusts his own judgment, follows his own desires rather than God's purpose for him. This is the same thing he infects Eve and our planet with. So what's God's purpose for us? We looked at this, and at least from a biblical model, is to have a relationship with God. And then the question is, well, how does that relationship grow? It grows by being tested. It's interesting to me that there is this tree of the knowledge of good and evil in a perfect world. Why does God put it there? Why does he put a tree of knowledge of good and evil? Why does he put something that people have to say no to in the Garden of Eden? I would say he put it there because it was designed to increase their love for him. Every time they came to that tree, it was in the center of the garden. Read about it in Genesis 2 and 3. It was in the midst of the garden. They had to choose to follow God. They had to reflect on all that God had done. So a tree of the knowledge of good and evil right in the midst of the garden. And it's quite interesting if you think about it. Perfect world, God puts it there because every time they saw it, they had the privilege of saying, I'm going to trust God. I'm going to reflect on what he's done for me. He's put me here. He's given us this beautiful garden. Even though this tree looks good to eat, I'm not going to eat it because God asked me not to. I love him. And love grows when it is tested. Quite interesting. Just like anything else, you grow your muscles by testing or stressing them. You grow your brain by stressing. And if I'm stressing your brain tonight, if some of this is going by quickly, that's why we film this. We also refer you to Pastor Bradshaw's meetings that some of these aspects he doesn't talk about, others he talks about in more detail. So they're complementary. So in essence, think about it this way. God said, I love you. I created you. I've made you. Now follow my loving direction. And when you follow my loving direction, I've put things in your environment that will ensure that your love for me will continue to grow. Now, years later, there's another place where God steps into human existence. It's a place called Mount Sinai. And God does something similar. He steps into human existence. He again says, I love you. Now this time I've recreated you. I've saved you. I've redeemed you. Now follow my loving direction, and it will ensure that your love for me will grow. So a lot of people say, well, are God's 10 commandments, are they arbitrary? They're not arbitrary. Show us the happiest way to live. The tree of the knowledge of good and evil was not arbitrary. God needed something in that garden, I would suggest, to allow people to choose between following their own heart and making choices based on love for God. And it was designed to bless them. It's quite interesting. The tree of the knowledge of good and evil was in the heart of the Garden of Eden. There's something in the heart of God's 10 commandments that looks arbitrary. Just like that tree of the knowledge of good and evil. A lot of people say, well, it just looked like any other tree. It looked good to eat, but God said, don't eat it. In the heart of the 10 commandments, there's something called the Sabbath commandment, right in the middle. And just like the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, in the heart of those 10 commandments is something that many people say, well, what difference does it make? You know, whether we worship God. I mean, worshiping him on a day, but God has put that there to bless us, okay? Adam and Eve couldn't but help to encounter the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Why? Whether they could spell knowledge or not. They couldn't, of course, spell English, I don't think, but you can see the author of this slide who will remain unnamed. Boy, that's the worst butchering of the word knowledge I've seen in a long time. I know I'm in good company because I've heard other distinguished people misspell words. But anyway, hopefully, you will be more gracious to me than some have been with others recently who have misspelled words. But anyway, it's the same with the Sabbath, the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. That which seemed to be of no importance maybe was most important. That which seemed to have no real purpose and seemed to be arbitrary was the best sign of allegiance and the greatest test and the greatest thing to cultivate love. So here's the question. Is it possible that the cause of sin and suffering is the failure to keep God's law? Now, I know this may sound like a radical question to ask, and many Christians say, oh boy, you're really missing the boat, because we want to look at the answer to all this too. And we want to bring in some other dimensions of this. And what I'm hoping will be our final installment of talking about this spiritual dimension. But you may have guessed it, our time for tonight's presentation has just about slipped away from us. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen and come back to you here. But I've been talking in several settings about this theme lately. and I've had the privilege to study with people individually on it. And I think there's some really fascinating dimensions to it. We're going to ultimately talk about why you have that back pain, and why God allows us to go through difficult situations. But we're trying to help you see the big picture. And as God looks at things from eternity, he's seeking to help all of us address sin on this planet, and especially in our lives. We're going to talk about that in detail next week. But I know I may have raised more questions than I've answered tonight. And although we finish up our regular session right at 8 o'clock, we're going to be doing that momentarily, we do give time for questions and answers and dialogue every night. Now, we record the 1-hour presentation, so everything we've done to this point will be recorded, but the remainder of the program will not be. So you can feel free that you can ask questions and interact. In order to do that, I am going to just take a moment, give you a moment break as we wind up, because I'm going to switch off our feed, switch off our recording on YouTube.